If you want to consider a genocide as a systematic killing of a group of people, they have genocide built into Sharia law right now. These people are not your allies. They are not the same as us. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible. It kills people for their identity, and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways.
Today, we're going to be talking about Asmongold, one of the most popular streamers on Twitch and also on YouTube, has a very successful YouTube channel based on stealing and giving his political opinions about things like wokeness in video games. Now, yesterday, Asmongold dropped the mask, which was barely on, and went on a genocidal rant about Palestinians. Now, I want to talk about this today, and I also want to show you how his rhetoric really isn't anything unique to people who think of themselves as somewhat liberal. Now, I don't think Asmongold thinks of himself as liberal in the traditional sense. His whole YouTube channel seems to be dedicated to, at this point, far-right politics. At the same time, part of his justification for not caring about Palestinians facing a genocide is they are backwards and they want to do genocide and, you know, they don't like gay people and stuff like that. The type of shit we've been hearing for a year in the mainstream, but the stuff, if you've been paying attention to what's been going on to Palestine since you've been into politics, this rhetoric has been very common for a long, long time. Basically that Palestinians are anti-gay, therefore we should kill them all. I made a whole video on this and I called it woke fascism, where you had Israeli soldiers going into the bombed out ruins of Gaza, waving rainbow flags, but at the same time saying they were afraid of what Netanyahu's government would do to Israeli LGBT rights. So that's the incoherence of the woke fascist mind. Do a genocide for a far-right government that also hates gay people to protect gay people from those barbarian Palestinians. Now, this video is very, very likely not going to be monetized, but if we are talking about Palestinian genocide, I have a fundraiser going right now. I originally had a goal of £1,000 for medical aid for Palestinians, which also works in Lebanon as well. And you guys have been amazing, absolutely smashed past that within like 2 hours. And it's now on over £5,000. And there's not really a limit on the fundraiser, so since there's momentum, please check it out if you haven't, check it out if you're new. And part of the reason I want to use this video is I know people will watch it because of the subject matter, and I want to use it to promote the charity. So yeah, please check that out. And also, just as usual, check out all my socials or whatever to follow me on all the social medias. Now, I don't really know much about Asmongold beyond like what most people probably know. I think he was a popular like World of Warcraft streamer at one point, but since I've been covering him, he's just been right-wing. He massively grifted off the Johnny Depp, Amber Heard courtroom stuff, celebrating when the verdict went in favor of Johnny Depp. He literally just have it on all day. And when you're doing that already, you're going to get a chud audience. But it seems like he's just been getting worse and worse and worse. Not to mention the fact he just like straight up steals YouTube videos and makes the platform a worse place. That's what I've covered him over when I've made content on his content. Now, if you go onto his subreddit, it's literally like 4chan poll. He has been radicalizing his own audience, but they've, I think, been radicalizing him back. And he just created this echo chamber on Twitter and his own subreddit where all he consumes is basically far-right garbage. So he's very much not different from someone like, let's say, The Quartering. Now, recently, this clip actually got his Twitch channel temporarily banned. You'd think it would get it full-on banned, but that's just not the world we live in. And I don't know the context. He has been talking about some of this stuff recently. He spoke to Hassan about it before. Spoke to Hassan about it afterwards. I don't really know why Hassan keeps inviting him on to talk about this. Asmongold has also said that people who don't know about this should not talk about it, which he didn't stick to his own rule. And also last week, he put up a video of him reacting to another right-wing channel talking about a country that kills illegal immigrants with a thumbnail like this, and with him agreeing with a lot of the sentiment of the video. It was about a place in Poland. So let's listen to what he has to say about the genocide in Palestine and obviously this comes after the viral images of, I think it was a teenager, a student, burning alive in a medical tent in Gaza, being killed by the Israelis. And that image will probably be a lasting legacy of the genocide. So we've had all of that context recently, and this is when he decides to say what you're going to hear.
If you want to consider a genocide as a systematic killing of a group of people, they have genocide built into Sharia law right now. So no, I'm not going to cry a fucking river when people who have genocide that's baked into their laws are getting genocided. I don't give a fuck. They're terrible people. It's not even a question. It's crazy that people don't see it that way. They'd be doing the same thing. And how much did they kill? As many as they can. They're not able to kill as many people as Israel because they don't have as many bombs and as many weapons. But if they did, they'd be doing the same thing. That's it. Just takes enough. That's right. These people are not your allies. They are not the same as us. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible. It kills people for their identity, and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways. It is that simple. No, I don't feel bad for them. I don't feel sorry for them. I don't care. I don't support them.
So what you heard there was someone actually being like a full-on Nazi, and also just proving my theory about the new form of fascism isn't straight up white supremacy, it's Western chauvinism. It's the belief that Western culture, whatever that fucking means, is absolutely superior, and anyone who opposes that is inferior and deserves terrible things to happen to them. And you hear this rhetoric coming out of basically the whole political spectrum in Europe right now about refugees from North Africa and the Middle East coming here. Oh, they, don't agree with our way of life. They hate your identity. They hate women. They hate gay people. All of that stuff. And why I find that particularly ironic coming out of this guy's mouth is this guy doesn't actually like people for their identity anyway, and he is a far-right grifter. So he'd probably have more in common with Islamists when he's complaining about woke culture and shit like that than he would with, I don't know, a communist like me, right? Someone who does care about protecting people's rights and civil rights and wanting more rights for people. This guy doesn't give a shit about that. It's just what they use to bash what they perceive as the barbarian Muslim hordes over their head. Now, what the fuck is he even talking about here? He's talking about maybe, let's say, Hamas, right? He's saying it's baked into their laws, genocide, which is also not true. And you can actually flip this around and say the Israeli government, genocide is actually built into Israeli law because the whole country is built on previous genocides and an ongoing genocide and keeps swallowing up parts of other countries based on ethnic cleansing, right? But he's not talking about the Israeli government. He's talking about the Hamas control over the Gaza Strip. I doubt this guy even knows that Hamas don't control the whole of the Palestinian territory, and they haven't over the history historically controlled most of it, and they also haven't been around for most of recent Palestinian history. So he clearly doesn't know what he's talking about, but he's saying, yeah, these people are just genocidal. If you allowed them out, they would kill all Israelis. And this is literally an argument going back to slavery. At one point, people used to start arguing for the slavery of African Americans because they said, if you free them, they will kill us all. I'm not joking. That is one of the arguments that was for slavery in America. And this is one of the arguments you hear a lot when colonizers do this type of stuff. If we stop, they'll kill us all. Which has been proven time and again not to be true, by the way, when these genocides end or things like slavery end or apartheid ends. Most of the time, this doesn't actually happen because what these people want and what they're fighting for is freedom and to live in peace, right? That's why insurgent movements often do these things. They don't end up just killing every single person who disagrees with them afterwards, or, I don't know, the remaining elements of their enemies who might be like civilians and stuff like that. Doesn't really happen. But if you're an insane racist who just thinks all Muslims are barbarians, now, what is so interesting about this clip is what I've just talked about is the belief that all Palestinians are genocidal. He doesn't just say that. He then goes on to say it's an inferior culture. And he basically doesn't feel bad that maybe 200,000, mainly young people, women, children, young students, young men, just working. They're being killed by Israeli bombs with intent to kill them all. He doesn't care. This is full Adolf Hitler rhetoric for the 21st century. It's Western chauvinist fascism. And this guy fundamentally just cannot see these people as human. And also, it's pure fascist racism, because you can take his argument and apply it to basically any group of people, right? Let's go back to when Donald Trump was president. Let's go back to when George Bush was president, right? When George Bush was president, the US was destroying the Middle East while also destroying the rights of Americans, and 70% of Americans supported the invasion of Iraq, right? Using Asmongold's logic here, I could say there is genocide built into the US government, which is true, by the way, just like the Israeli government. It's literally the foundation of the US government is genocide. And we take that, they're supporting more war, they're supporting colonialism, war around the world, killing thousands and thousands of civilians. Therefore, if there was a genocide against all Americans, I wouldn't feel bad. And America has an inferior culture. Look at the way they structure their cities. No universal healthcare. Look at all the stuff to do with like murders and everything. Americans are so inferior. Let's just kill them all and I wouldn't shed a tear, right? That's the argument you can make based on this argument. Would he agree with the argument I'm making right then? Of course he wouldn't agree. And if I said, this applies to you as well, Asmongold, you're not tolerant, you're conservative, you want to set us back, you want to attack the rights of minorities, you're a fucking racist, fascist piece of shit, and I think all of you should be killed, anyone who thinks like you in America, how would he react to that? If you start doing a hierarchy of culture based on things like identity politics and some sort of vague notion of Western tolerance, then we can start doing this. I can do it to you then, because that is how racism started in the fucking first place. The Spanish said to the Muslims and Jews, well, you guys are racially inferior to us, partly because of your religion. And then the Dutch and the English said to the Spanish, well, actually, you're racially inferior to us because you all have tan skin and dark hair, which means you must have mixed your blood with the Muslims and Jews. So therefore, we're racially superior. Because racism is absolutely incoherent and based on absolute nonsense. And this guy is just a full-on Nazi who has radicalized himself online and probably doesn't leave his fucking bedroom as he talks about himself. He just seems like a really nasty piece of shit. And I've heard him talk about other stuff, how he doesn't care about anything, he has no morals, doesn't give a shit about anything in the world. So him not being moved by a genocide is one thing, but then him basically justifying the genocide as these people deserve it, because if you let them have freedom, they would kill all Israelis, right? That's basically what he's saying. But obviously to us, what he says is very, very extreme, right? But he's actually reflecting a sentiment that is extremely common, sadly. So if we move on from Asmongold, I was just like watching my video from November 2023, and it was called something like calling out terrible liberal takes on Israel-Palestine. So this guy is called Hutch. He's like a liberal politics streamer. I think he might have been like a gaming streamer before. And unsurprisingly, this tweet is gone. You can't find it. And I also expect that it was probably deleted this year and not last year. So he writes on the 5th of November 2023, Israel is not trying to murder all Palestinians in Gaza. That's the point. The death count is sobering and horrific, but intent has to matter. If a campaign of genocide was actually what Israel was going for, my friend, the circumstances that we see now would be unimaginably worse. Pointing to extremist voices in the Knesset engaging in maniacal rhetoric doesn't negate what's actually happening. Okay, Israel wasn't doing a genocide, it never intended to, didn't have a far-right government that had always wanted to do this. Goes on, Hamas straight up comes out and says, we want to annihilate every Jew and the end state of Israel. Their attack on October 7th was not a military strike, it was a full-on genocidal action. There doesn't seem to be any real acknowledgement of this from the folks that keep screaming genocide over and over again. So you can probably see why this was deleted, right? You can probably see because he's saying genocide was never the intent, which everyone knew. I'd been calling it a genocide for years and years before what's been happening recently. Everyone knew. And then going on to say, actually, what Hamas did is a genocide. Which, you know, for most people, they can recognize if you keep people locked up in an open-air prison, they're probably going to attack quite viciously. And yes, what they did with civilians is bad. but you can so see it in the contextualization of that's a military strike, because most of the targets were the IDF. But again, although it's framed different in a more maybe intellectual way, this guy's still a piece of shit. He's still a Western chauvinist fascist as well, and it's playing into the exact same thing. Everyone who's a Palestinian, they want to kill every single Jew. If you let Palestinians have any semblance of freedom, they're just going to kill every single Jew, right? Also conflating like the violence they enact as some sort of anti-Semitic thing rather than an anti-Zionist thing, because the Zionists are their occupiers and captors. Like I'm saying, these people are fundamentally insanely racist. Now, if we move on from that, again, let's talk about other supposed liberal people, like that Hutch guy, right? He probably thinks of himself as quite a liberal person, tolerant for LGBT rights, all that stuff. Now, Asmongold was using that as well, which is more ironic in his case because it doesn't seem like someone who gives a shit about tolerance of any kind. But Sam Harris is someone I've covered a lot with his takes on Israel, and his language as another like centrist liberal is completely basically indistinguishable from the other two things I've just read you, right? Basically, Israel aren't trying to do a genocide. They never have wanted to. When they kill civilians, it's an accident. But Hamas, even though they've never done a genocide and they haven't done a genocide, they would actually do it. So you must kill them first. So let's listen to him talk about this. And then I want to play one more clip, which I've played you a lot of times, where he talks about this idea of the West. And this is during the Donald Trump presidency, which is funny. But let's watch this one first.
Whatever terrible things the Israelis have done, it is also true to say that they have used more restraint in their fighting against the Palestinians than we, the Americans and the Europeans, have used in any of our wars. Israel built bomb shelters to protect its citizens. The Palestinians built tunnels through which they could carry out terror attacks and kidnap Israelis. Should Israel be blamed for successfully protecting its population in a defensive war? What do we know of the Palestinians? What would the Palestinians do to the Jews in Israel if the power imbalance were reversed? Well, they have told us what they would do. For some reason, Israel's critics just don't want to believe the worst about a group like Hamas, even when it declares the worst of itself. We've already had a Holocaust and several other genocides in the 20th century. People are capable of committing genocide. When they tell us they intend to commit genocide, we should listen. There is every reason to believe that the Palestinians would kill all the Jews in Israel if they could. Would every Palestinian support genocide? Of course not. But vast numbers of them, and of Muslims throughout the world, would. Needless to say, Palestinians in general, and not just Hamas, have a history of targeting innocent non-combatants in the most shocking ways possible. They've blown themselves up on buses and in restaurants. They've massacred teenagers. They've murdered Olympic athletes. They now shoot rockets indiscriminately into civilian areas. And again, you have to ask yourself, what do these groups want? What would they accomplish if they could accomplish anything? What would the Israelis do if they could do what they want? They would live in peace with their neighbors, if they had neighbors who would live in peace with them. They would simply continue to build out their high-tech sector and thrive. What do groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and even Hamas want? They want to impose their religious views on the rest of humanity. They want to stifle every freedom that decent and educated and secular people care about. This is not a trivial difference. And yet, judging from the level of condemnation that Israel now receives, you would think the difference ran the other way. This kind of confusion puts us all in danger. This is the great story of our time. For the rest of our lives, and the lives of our children, we're going to be confronted by people who don't want to live peacefully in a secular, pluralistic world, because they are desperate to get to paradise, and they're willing to destroy the very possibility of human happiness along the way. The truth is, we are all living in Israel. It's just that some of us haven't realized it yet.
So there's Sam Harris basically saying the same thing as Asmongold. Hamas and Palestinians, he's saying generally Palestinians, not just Hamas, they want to kill all the Jews. And if we should take that seriously, and all these groups are just one, they all have the same political aims to get to paradise, Sharia law, all that scary stuff. And these people fundamentally don't look at the political context that any of these groups exist in, not least that a lot of these groups fucking hate each other. Like, the Taliban are literally fighting ISIS right now in Afghanistan, but we lump them all together as one entity because, yeah, religious conservatives don't all just get along because they're religious conservatives. Otherwise, most Muslim groups in the Middle East would absolutely love each other, right? No, they all have political aims. The same with Christian groups throughout history, even like ones that share the exact same religion, go to war over political aims, even though they believe in the same fucking religion, right? But again, it's seeing seeing Muslims as all subhuman, seeing them as this monolithic entity where they all just believe in just the worst forms of religion, and they would happily kill all Jews if they could, and they'd support all this stuff, ignoring the context that the worst anti-Semitism historically has been in Christian Europe, and most anti-Semitism in the Middle East is fundamentally linked to the Israeli occupation, right? Not saying that makes it right, but also when you have a colonial project coming in saying this is the face of Judaism, and if you're a Jew who opposes us, you're not actually a Jew, you can understand why people get confused with this stuff. And that's what's happening right now with people like Netanyahu and loads of very prominent Jews saying, well, if you're a Jew who's against Israel's genocide, then you're like a capo in Nazi Germany. Again, absolutely insane, and makes Jews far less safer in the world, but they're happy to do this. Now, this is what they're saying about Israel specifically, but I've talked a lot about woke fascism in my videos. So woke fascism is basically doing terrible things, like I said, doing terrible things, justifying genocide, justifying basically fascist shit based on liberal identity politics and liberalism. That's why there's a popular saying, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds, because there isn't really much separating liberals and fascists, and you're seeing that in America with the election right now. And you see that in America with just the various presidencies. Obama, Trump, and Joe Biden all basically shared the exact same foreign policy. And Joe Biden has armed a genocide and is continuing to do it to the end of his presidency. And the Democratic establishment are basically choosing Israel's genocide over winning another election because, yeah, they don't give a shit really about an election. And also, there's not that much difference for most of the world. Who becomes the president of the US empire keeps chugging along in a similar way, which is doing what's ever best for US power, which means US capital. But to justify the terrible shit we do in the West, we have to coat it in something. So now what we're doing now is we're talking about LGBT rights, do a genocide for the gay community. And then also in Europe, far-right parties are bringing in free speech laws to tackle anti-Semitism, right? Actual Nazis are passing laws to tackle anti-Semitic hate speech, which almost always is about cracking down on anti-Zionist, just general speech, not hate speech, general speech. And they're doing that because fundamentally now, most people in Europe, most political parties agree, we hate Muslims the most. And Muslim immigrants and Muslim refugees will be the boogeyman. And obviously, a lot of Jewish and Christian Zionists are going along with this. And again, it makes it unsafe for them because what they don't realize is, yeah, the far right hate Muslims. They also don't like Jews very much. And if they are supporting Israel right now, it's based purely on the fact that they both want Jews to all go to Israel and they love Israel for brutalizing Muslims, but don't get that twisted for the West suddenly loving Jewish people because anti-Semitism has never been higher, and that includes anti-Semites who support Israel, like people like Tommy Robinson. But let's listen to Sam Harris perfectly articulate what woke Western fascism is. And this is the shit that Asmongold, Hutch, and himself, Sam Harris, have all been espousing recently.
Douglas and I spent a lot of time in this podcast, certainly most of the time, talking about the situation in Europe with respect to immigration and Islam and the social attitudes in the Muslim community that are at odds with values that really must be non-negotiable, like free speech and women's rights and gay rights. And in particular, we're worried about protecting them from many of the illiberal people who have been pouring into Europe. In this one, we more or less fully agree on what we're against. And if you think that puts the matter too strongly, you haven't read Douglas's book, and you probably haven't been paying much attention to what's been happening in Europe. And if you think one has to be a fan of Trump in order to worry about this, well, then you haven't been paying attention to this podcast. But on the topic of Trump, Trump just gave a speech in Poland where he said, and I quote, "The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert or destroy it?" End quote. And while I find abundant fault with the messenger, as you know. I can't find fault with that particular message. And the fact that liberals can't seem to see what's at stake here, the fact that they are embarrassed to defend, quote, Western values, as though that were synonymous with racism, or the legacy of colonialism, or xenophobia, or a lack of compassion, that is making liberalism politically defunct at this point. And that increasingly worries me. And happily in the United States, we are in a better situation demographically and with respect to immigration and just geographically. And that has implications for immigration. But one cannot be cheerful about what's been happening in Europe.
So during the early days of the Nazi regime, Joseph Goebbels actually made a speech that sounds kind of similar to a lot of his rhetoric. The main difference is he referenced Judeo-Bolshevism a lot. Not that we don't still see that come up with cultural Marxism and the hysteria around that with these enlightened liberal intellectuals, but what you heard Sam Harris there articulate is that we must stop illiberal Muslims from pouring into Europe. And this is when Donald Trump gave a speech in Poland when it had a fascist government. This is 2018, right? So apparently we all agree in the West about LGBT rights, tolerance, free speech. We don't. This is a pure fantasy. There is uniform support for a genocide right now by most Western governments, right? And a lot of them, like the UK and the US, have been arming it throughout. And our Labour government right now are right-wing capitalists who are also been attacking trans rights. Genocide, attacking trans rights, deregulating the economy, privatising the healthcare that we've enjoyed in this country for decades and decades. That's Western values, right? So what do I share with that? That's not my values at all. And then that's why it's obviously so bizarre. They use identity politics to turn us against each other. So I'm apparently now, according to Asmongold, because I might socially disagree on LGBT rights with more people in the Muslim world than in the Western world, that means I should not care they're getting killed in massive numbers by bombs made in the country I'm from and my taxes pay for and my government supports. I shouldn't care about that because socially, they're backwards. So they deserve to die. And this rhetoric has always been used to demonize people who have been colonized, right? And it's also just fucking insane. We have more in common with the people facing the genocide than we do with Elon Musk, right-wing billionaires and millionaires. And we're closer to being refugees crossing the English Channel than we are to being a Tory MP or some shit like that. And that's what people need to remember. And it's just so funny to see right-wingers, obviously cynically, use identity politics to try and attack leftists for supporting Palestinians or anyone who might not agree with us socially. Because guess what? We're humans and left-wing people recognise our common humanity. So although we have our differences based on religion or social values, we hope we can work through them together and come together for the benefit of humanity and overcome these differences. And also another thing, if you're bombing people in a genocide and saying you're doing it for LGBT rights, do you think that's going to make them accept them more? Or is it going to make them more hostile? And what I always say is a lot of this stuff is to do with economic standing and economic development. And how are these places meant to develop economically if we keep putting in dictators or we keep funding their eradication? It's never going to happen. So even from that standpoint, you can't justify a genocide of these people do not one-for-one align my values. And I bet there are far more Palestinians I have more in common with than I do with Asmongold, who also is a millionaire, by the way, right? A millionaire fucking fascist who is saying that Palestinians deserve a genocide because they don't agree with his supposed tolerant views. His tolerant views that include liking countries killing illegal immigrants and being a general piece of shit misogynist fascist. That's a guy who I have more in common with. Why? He thinks just because based on our skin colour and language, although I have nothing fucking in common with this guy. So that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think of Asmongold going full Hitler. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.